Welcome to Business Line's State of the Economy podcast, where you'll find insight, analysis, and the story behind the numbers.
Hello, listeners. Welcome to Business Line's State of the Economy podcast. This is your host, Anjana. And today we are here to discuss all about the measurements and numbers when it comes to India's digital economy. While trying to understand a bit various measurement system, I came across an interesting report titled State of India's Digital Economy, SIDE Report 2024 by the Indian Council for Research on International Economic Relations. The report has extensively discussed the CHIPS framework, India's progress when it comes to digitization and its measurements. To discuss in detail, we are joined by Deepak Mishra, Director and CE of the Indian Council for Research on International Economic Relations, and Mansi Kedia, Senior Fellow from the Indian Council for Research on International Economic Relations. So, Deepak, the very first question is that anything in this universe, we have certain kind of definitions, and we would like to define in numerous ways. When it comes to digitalization of an economy, how can it be defined, and what frameworks have generally been used by global organizations to measure the level of digitalization of an economy?
Hi, Anjana. It's wonderful to be on your podcast. So as we mentioned in the report, there's a whole cottage industry of around how to measure digitalization. And in the report, we picked three of those, which are the most well-known indicators. This is the International Telecommunication Union's ICT Development Index, the World Economic Forum's Network Readiness Index, and the United Nations e-government development index. So these are very widely known. That's why we picked those three. But there's a huge number of other indices produced by World Bank and other multilateral and global organizations. So what framework do they use? Obviously, each of them have their own framework. They were created at a certain period of time, and they were relevant at that point of time. But over the decades, as digitalization has moved in, they haven't really changed the framework, while they've tried to update it once in every few years. But they're still close to the roots they started with, which makes them slightly less relevant today. So let me give you a simple way to understand the framework they use. So think of, in each economy, there are three agents: the people, the business, and the government agencies broadly. So think of that as three columns in your matrix. And then the rows as the way we use internet. So the first is connection. So how do you connect people to the internet? And then uses, all other things. So think of the rows as the various stages of uses of the internet or the digital economy. So that becomes a matrix of, let's say, 4 or 5 rows, depending on how many stages of digitalization you're thinking, and then 3 columns. So that's like a 3x3 or 4x3 matrix. What has happened is all these organizations focus on particularly 1 or 2 cells in that matrix. So ITU will look at connectivity with people. So how people are connected to the internet. That's the only focus out of those 9 cells or 10, 12 cells. They only focus on 1. eGov Index, the UN, they'll focus on government agencies and their connection and their usage. So basically 2 cells out of 12 or 15. The World Economic Forum is actually fairly broad. It's closest to what we produce, but they have other problems, which is that they mix inputs and outputs and all sorts of things, which makes them less relevant. So the framework is basically that there are many stages of digitalization, and there are 3 agents in the economy. And if you want to do a good job, we should capture the entire matrix and not just 1 cell or 2 cells in that matrix.
Right. So that brings in a lot of clarity. And Mansi, my question is, so your report is stating about a different framework to measure digitalization. What was the need for a new framework, and what were the gaps in the existing frameworks used by global organizations?
Thank you, Anjana. So in addition to what has already been said, which is that, the way in which digitalization has been conceptualized in the existing indices, there's a couple of things that I wanted to add. One is that the scope of digitalization, as is understood in these existing indices, is very much led by how developed countries approached digitalization, which is that they first connected and then they started adopting different uses and the use cases expanded. And then there were new and innovative technologies. So it's like a linear path, right?
Okay.
But developing countries, in some sense, leapfrogged. So there are lots of examples from India, Africa, China, where even without a lot of connectivity, individual citizens, governments, businesses had started to use different versions of the internet in different forms, low bandwidth, offline, and that leapfrogging happened. And that is why this framework that the framework that we developed looks at each of these components and not necessarily a path that was followed where one needs to achieve 80% or 90% connectivity and then follow on to try and see what are the users and then look at innovation and things like that. So I think that's one of the reasons to look at a more non-linear approach to digitalization, which is based on frugal innovation in developing countries, because they don't have the same type of resources and institutions that allow for a similar digitization experience. The other, I think, especially that is relevant to developing countries like India and the likes of India, China, which are developing and also very large in terms of population. Most of these indices don't capture the scale or the size of the network, right? For example, in India, we have, almost half of the population, like roughly speaking, connected, and half of the population that are not using the internet. But that still brings us to about 700 million users, which is larger than the population of a lot of other countries. And we use the example of Fiji in our report to demonstrate that they are ranked higher, much higher than India, because even with their 700,000 people, their levels of penetration are much higher than that of India. So that scale effect or the size of the network, which matters a lot in case of digitalization, is not captured by these indices. So most of the measurement that happens is in per capita terms or penetration or density, and not in terms of the scale of the network. Something that was mentioned was the mixing up of the inputs and the outputs. I just want to clarify and build on that a little bit, is that a lot of these indices like the Network Readiness Index and even the UN eGov Index, they not only measure the outcome of digitalization, which is like how much is the connectivity or how much is the adoption of a certain type, but also the enablers that require for you to reach there. For example, the levels of income, the levels of literacy, the levels of digital literacy, and which lands up double penalizing developing countries that have not only achieved lower levels of the outcome, but are at lower levels of outcomes because they are at lower levels of inputs. So this sort of double marginalization that happens for developing countries, or the opposite holding true for developed countries where they're better off at both, also skews the index in the favor of the developed countries. So in our framework, we have tried to stay away from inputs as much as possible and only focused on outcome variables. However, having said that, there are some variables that you may say are on the border or on the fence of being inputs and outputs, but to the extent possible, we have tried to reduce this error of double counting, which can penalize developing countries.
Would you say that this chip framework that is suggested is the best or is the preferred method to measure the digital economy in India? If so, could you just explain framework with greater detail?
Let me come in here, Anjana. So I think obviously we are biased, but we do feel like chips is the state of the art at this point of time. Why is that the case? As Mansi just mentioned, whether you are moving on a linear path of digitalization or a non-linear path, whether you are doing incremental changes or you are leapfrogging, framework is going to capture you fairly either way. So it doesn't matter the path of digitalization you've taken, it would be a fair representation of where you are. So what is the CHIPS framework? So, as we said, it's the full spectrum of digitalization. So C stands for connect. How do you connect all the people, all the businesses, and all the government agencies to internet in affordable and high quality? That's about connection. The Harness is how are we using this technology to generate growth, create jobs, improve service delivery. So that's a real impact pillar. The third is innovation, which is where how are we using the technology at the frontier, because that defines the path and the future of the country. So we are focused on innovation. Fourth is, I think, the most interesting pillar, because nobody actually looks at it carefully, because we know that digital economy has benefits and risks, and nobody tries to capture the risk part of it. So protection is how are we defending our people, business, and government agencies against cyber attack, privacy, how are you protecting their online privacy and misinformation, kind of things. And finally, sustainability is how our digital economy is green and sustainable. So we have 5 pillars. Under each pillar, there are a bunch of sub-pillars. So total, there are 16 sub-pillars. So for Connect, for example, there are 3 sub-pillars. One is about access, one is about affordability, and the third one is about quality of the internet. Similarly for others, and then under each sub-pillar, there are a bunch of indicators. Interestingly, these are the same indicators that others use, except that they don't use the full spectrum. So we are not really creating new indicators. And these are publicly available indicators. So we pick 50 indicators to capture those 16 sub-pillars and the 5 pillars. And then we kind of do a simple spreadsheet calculation to calculate what this all adds up to. So in a sense, why is this better than others? I would say there are 3 things. First is, I don't want to be unfair to global indices, because they were prepared at a certain period of time with a certain mandate, and they were very relevant at that point of time. But over time, they have become a bit outdated. So there is nothing against those global indices. I think we like them. We think they're relevant. They just need to, they're good, but they should become better over time. But there are 3 things what CHIPS stands for. One is, the CHIPS is much more comprehensive and relevant for today's time. Second is analytically more accurate, because we do not include inputs and outputs, so no double counting, or at least minimal double counting. Finally, I think it reflects, as Mansi said, the reality of digitalization in developing countries much more accurately, especially for large emerging market like China, India, Indonesia. And I would say, while we didn't include it, Nigeria, Kenya, for them, I think the strength of the digitalization is much higher than what the global indices are capturing it to be. That's why we think everybody should be using chips. And we will be actually working on this for a very long time to make sure that some of the other indicators starts to apply the scale effect, reduce double counting, and take the full spectrum into account when they calculate it.
That brings in a lot of insights here, but I was just wondering, would you have some findings from your report with regards to the level of digitalization between India and other G20 countries?
Yeah, so I think let's say I think the highlight, or the kind of the headline of our report is, if you start using chips and correct for the double counting problem, as well as the account for the scale effect, India's ranking will be much higher than what has been generally portrayed. And if you only the scale effect, which is the kind of, as you said, the GDP of the economy, similar to like what is the absolute size of the digital economy in India, then India is the 3rd largest digitalized country in the world. Actually, we do it for G20, but the way this is constructed, it will also be for all, because this is only at a scale effect, and G20 are the largest countries, so others are much smaller. So India is the 3rd largest digitalized country in the world after US and China. I think that's a big news. I think while intuitively, possible once you understand what you're doing, but the fact that India is such a large market for digitalization is very important for many, for our policymakers, for our regulators, for our businesses to really think, digest, and internalize this information. Second is, what is interesting is, even if you look at the per capita, or the intensity level, the user level digitalization, India is 12th among G20 countries, which is also a big deal, because India is the poorest country among G20. So as long as income tends to be very positively correlated with digitalization, one would expect India to be the 19th, because in G20 there are 19 countries and EU. So India would have been the 19th one. The fact that it's 12th It's above a G7 country like Italy, and it's above all the G20 developing countries like Mexico, Brazil, Turkey, South Africa, Russia, and others. Is, I think, tells you that India's level of digitalization, both at aggregate level as well as the user level, is much, much higher than what we have generally started to believe based on the global ranking and the numbers that you see. I think that's, to me, is the most important one. If you want to go to the second layer of findings, I think what we find is when it comes to absolute level, India does very well when it comes to connect and harness, which are scale intensive pillars. But when you come to user, I think the most interesting thing is India does very well on innovation pillar. In fact, we scored the highest among all five. And that's might look a bit surprising. People say, oh, how can India be so innovative? We haven't produced any product which are globally recognized, all that. But what is interesting is, to give you an example, India's startups are, we know the startups economy is doing, relatively well. Of course, currently they're going through a bit of a funding issue, but overall India has done well. But relative to India's economy, the size of India's startup economy is much larger than what you find even in China and the US. So
Right.
China and US have absolutely larger startups economy, but relative to the size, India is much better. Similarly, when it comes to contribution to AI publication, to GitHub and other things, India actually comes out, even at a per user level, one of the highest in the world. So that was the interesting finding, is that not just we are doing well at a global level on both and economy-wide and user, but even at a pillar level like innovation and even harness, we are actually doing relatively well compared to what one would have thought based on a per capita income.
That brings me to my very next question. So while we were expanding the term chips, we came across two pillars, that is connect and harness. So this, from your report, what I can understand is that both these terms contribute 66% to India's total score. So how can India improve its ranking?
I think what you're referring to, Anjana, is the chips economy
Right.
outcomes that you're looking at. So there, certainly, as was explained, it's largely driven by the scale effects, because the sub-pillars, as you will see, for connect and harness are on number of internet users, number of smartphone users, and just number of people using e-commerce or online health services, food ordering, all of those things, which are essentially running into millions. And it's much higher than and in an absolute sense, it's much higher than any other country in the world except for China, and in some cases, the US. So these are all scale-driven results that we see. The same pillars. So if you look at connect, not so much harness, but if you look at connect, we're really the last when we look at per capita terms or the chips economy, which is the percentage of people connected to the internet. So, this is what we call in our report also the duality of India, where we have the second highest number of internet users in the world and the highest number of non-users in the world. So I think there is a need to work more towards inclusive connectivity, and the government is, in fact, through its USOF program and through other public-private partnerships, trying to build that connect pillar. I think that is really the foundation for the digital economy, not something that we can keep vulnerable, because unless people have good access, a lot of the innovation and harnessing that is currently happening will not be possible. And I think the other important point that I want to make is that the next half of the Indian population that needs to come onto the internet will also not be as automatic as it has been for the first half. Given their low levels of per capita income, low competencies, literacy, and other socioeconomic conditions. So that it will require a slightly more different policy push, much more hand-holding in terms of getting this next set of population onto the internet. So if we want to see this sustained effect, one is naturally through the growth process as per capita income levels rise, there will be an increase in digitalization. But if we really want to go to the last man or last woman, there will need to be a certain targeted policy towards bringing marginalized populations such as women, children, disabled, the very poor or the ultra poor onto the internet. So those policies will need to be targeted. what I'm trying to say in short is that we shouldn't take this existing growth for granted for the rest of the population or for the future.
We were just speaking about the making all the facilities to reach to the last men and last women. So my question is a little bit on the lines of gender here. So do you find, or is there a gender gap in digital consumption in India? And if so, what are the reasons? Could you just elaborate?
Yes, let me try doing that. There is certainly a gender divide, and and let's look at it pillar wise. So in the connect pillar, the gender gap, when we looked at it in 2019-20, the gender gap was extremely high.
Okay.
And the numbers that we report this year, so in a span of 2 years, that gender gap has drastically declined, and it was so much so that we as researchers and people putting together the numbers actually went back to the survey agency to find out what happened. So this gender gap in connectivity has closed largely due to the shared use of internet among middle-aged rural women.
Right.
And obviously it's not the perfect solution, and it's probably not going to deliver on impact as much as exclusive use will, but it's a starting point. And the reason, I think the other reason that explains, the high or the rising gap and then the falling gap is because it is understood through literature that it's usually the men who get access to the internet first. And that is the time when the gender gap starts to increase. And once men have reached a certain threshold, then women start getting access to the internet, and that's when the gender gap starts to diminish drastically. So I think that is the process that was happening in the last 2 or 3 years, where we saw an expanding gender gap and then a sharp decrease in the gender gap. And so much that in all states except for Jharkhand, there was a fall in gender gap in connectivity. We don't have very good data on gender gaps in use. For instance, whether the same number of men and women use e-commerce, or whether the same number of men and women use digital payments. There isn't a data source that we could come to in India or across the world that we could use. But from anecdotal evidence, there is certainly a gap. But there are also certain pockets of the internet where you find women using it much more than men. And this you will find in the case of social media, certainly, and also among the special influencer community that you see and other sort of creative jobs that have come onto the internet. But we can't speak very solidly in the absence of data on how that gap looks for harness.
Right. So I'm just curious to understand how is the difference of digital divide among various Indian states. So, Deepak, could you just take us through how big is the digital divide among Indian states? And is there an implication of this for the work of the 16th Finance Commission? So if there is a divide, how can we narrow it down?
Yeah, so good question, Anjana. So first is we wanted to compare the Indian states using the same framework that we do for the countries, so that we can compare Indian states with countries. Like we want to compare Delhi with Singapore, because that would be the right benchmark, rather than Delhi with, say, Jharkhand.
Okay.
Or so that was the idea. But then unfortunately, because the data for the Indian states, the source and the quality of the data is very different than global, we could not end up doing that comparison, which we hope to do in the site 2025. But in 24, we can compare among Indian states and we can compare among countries, but not between them. So what are the findings from the state level? So I think I want to just highlight three, and the one, including the one you mentioned, the digital divide. So first is, the results are not as surprising at the state level as it was at the country level. So states with higher income, more urbanization, greater literacy, like the ones in South and in the West, tends to do better in digitalization. So Karnataka, Maharashtra, Telangana, Tamil Nadu, Gujarat are the states which are in the top 5 or 6 in the India level. But what is interesting is that we do find that the geographical disparity between rural and urban India is also declining or narrowing, as we are seeing the narrowing of the gender gap. So while we haven't looked at whether this is happening, the gap is closing between Bihar and Karnataka, but the fact that it's also closing between rural and urban, we believe that even at the state level, the widening digital divide that we had seen for some time is starting to converge. Could be because of COVID, could be because of DPIs or whatever the things, but that's a good news that both the gender and the geographical divide are starting to converge. The second is, which is related, that the disparity in level of digitalization between Indian states is interestingly lower than the level of disparity in digitalization across the G20 countries. So if you look at the highest G20 country, the highest level of digitalization, the lowest, versus within India, the Indian digitalization disparity is lower, which is a good news, though, one, it's not easy to always compare between countries, and within a country, because we have uniform policy institutions, you expect that the ideas and the technology will diffuse faster. So it should not come as a surprise, but it was reassuring to know that there is not massive disparity and growing disparity among Indian states. Third finding is, we find that some of the poorer states or low-income states use more publicly provided digital services. So their consumption digital parts is more on public provided sites, so like Ayushman Bharat, or could be some of the DPIs, are much more used there. Whereas for the high income states, on a relative scale, they are more intensive in privately used digital services, which would be e-commerce or food delivery and other things. And that is also not unexpected, because private sector tends to cater to people with money, and the more wealthier and high income households are in richer states. So you would see that. But the good news is, so first is the disparity geographically is converging. Second is that the disparity within Indian states is less than across G20 countries. Third is poorer states tend to consume more publicly provided digital services, whereas rich states tend to consume more privately provided digital services.
Right. So this is not anything related to Indian states, but I'm just curious that there was this one sentence or statement in your report saying that digitalization has made dramatic progress, but the way it is being measured has not. So what is the key message here? Could you just take us through it?
Okay, let me try to take this question. So I think what we are basically saying is that, we know that, the whole internet thing started in the 1990s and took off first in the West, in the rich countries, and then it started coming to India and other developing countries. And all these global indices were created in the late 1990s, early 2000s. So, so they have been basically dated by 20 years. Sometimes they have tried to kind of make some marginal incremental improvement, but they haven't really adapted to the full swing of the digital economy, which makes them a slightly outdated concept, and especially less relevant for developing countries, because developing countries have taken a pathway which sometimes is very different than the rich countries. So to us, I'll very quickly summarize the 5 takeaways. First is, I think measuring digitalization, as you said, hasn't kept pace with the speed and the pace of growth of the digital economy, and that makes the current global indices outdated. The second is, many of the global indices consistently underestimate the strength of digitalization in large emerging markets for the reasons that we have discussed. Third is, if you correct for some of those limitations, then India would rank third largest digitalized country in the world in absolute terms, and 12th largest in relative terms among G20 countries, which would be much higher than what you would have expected based on the traditional indicators. And fourth is, I think within India, things are starting to improve when it comes to gender divide, when it comes to geographical divide. And the Indian states actually are doing a pretty decent job in terms of diffusing digitalization across in a state's border. So those are good news. But as Mansi had mentioned, there are still a lot of works to be done in terms of getting the rest, 800 million Indians on board, improving the gender divide, because while its gap is closing, it's on a very low base. So we need to, even today, only 4 out of 10 rural women have access to internet. So that, it's still a glass half full story. And the final point I want to, appeal to the global organization that they should review the way they estimate or measure digitalization for the country and try to make them up to date. Because while they're good, they need to become better at it. And we as an organization will continue to keep and watch on this and make sure that this happens, because we produce this report every year and continue to have a debate with them to make sure that some of these ideas get reflected in global discussion.
Right. Thank you so much, Deepak, for that answer. So I have my last set of questions, and it's about businesses and digital payment system here in India. So, Mansi, I just wanted to understand that this report, in that I could note one particular sentence which said, while most businesses are connected to the internet, many individuals are not. Why is that? Like, do you think businesses are more connected to the internet and individuals still do not have access to internet as such? Could you just explain this statement?
Yes, Anjana, I think that's what the data is showing. And one can go back and redo a sample and check. But from the latest data that is available, and this is data that we have from IMRB's ITOPS survey, what we find is that most businesses, and this is across the large businesses with 100 plus employees and even the really small businesses with less than 10 employees, a large proportion of them not only are connected to the internet, but are also selling online and marketing online. And the gap between the large and the small firms is very small. But this sort of, and it is definitely a COVID-led increase, because if you look at the data in the earlier years, pre-COVID years, not only is the gap very high, but even the larger firms were not as much connected to the internet. But COVID has given firms and businesses a push to be able to sell online. Whether or not that is translating into value or profits, that's a separate question. But if you're only looking at whether or not they can sell online, whether or not they're connected to the internet, the answer for all of that is yes, as per the survey data. However, that's not true for individuals. As you know, we spoke extensively about the gaps in connectivity and the fact that almost half of our population is not using the internet. I mean, while COVID did help increase connectivity, and there was a large proportion of first-time users of the internet in the post-COVID era, it's still, that gap is still high, which means that a lot more needs to be done in terms of making the internet affordable and more available and more usable for a lot of people who lack to see, or where content is not available in the languages that they can access. So while what COVID could do for businesses is not what it could do as much for individuals.
Okay, so then let's talk about digital payment system here then. So you're talking about businesses, and we are here, every day using UPI. And do you think that digital payment system has actually helped India to improve its digital economy?
Yeah, certainly. I think without a doubt. In fact, we are putting out a paper on UPI adoption perhaps tomorrow. Wow. Yeah, so I think the diffusion of digital payments through UPI has been much more inclusive than we saw through earlier versions of digital payments, which were debit cards, credit cards. Even wallets were not able to diffuse in the way UPI was able to. Because, I mean, one was definitely policy, but the other was also the nature of the technology and the network effects that it created. So digital payments have definitely, I mean, they're not an end by themselves. So not digital payments for the sake of digital payments, but also the role that digital payments have played in enhancing other aspects of the digital economy, such as facilitating more e-commerce. And by e-commerce, I just don't mean online retail, but just buying and selling a lot of digital services has become possible because of digital payments. And now digital payments are also becoming a source of increasing digital lending. So it has that efficiency and innovation effect that we are seeing. But again, like if you look at, I mean, everything comes with a but in the context of India sometimes, is because our growth of UPI users has sort of slowed down. While the number of transactions, volume of transactions, value of transactions, they're all exploding. if you really look at the number of people using UPI, that has really slowed down. So we haven't been able to cross, in the last number we know is about 330 million or 350 million. And that number is growing very slowly. So if you want to see higher diffusion or more number of users, some more will need to be done. But as a catalyst, I would definitely say digital payments have been doing their bit and are going to continue doing that bit, especially in the form of the UPI type of digital payments.
I think that's it from my end. I'm so happy that we were able to do this podcast. And thank you so much, Mansi and Deepak, for joining with us today. I'm sure our listeners would have gained a lot of insight from this conversation. Thank you so much.